Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is a collaboration among about 70 groups looking at ways to commemorate the beginnings of the American Revolution. And I am Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group, and I also teach history at Suffolk University. And our guest today is Alan Taylor. Thank you, Alan, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on.
And Professor Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia and the author of a number of very interesting, well-written, exciting books. I was going to say important books, but then people think I don't need to read them. But these are really books well worth reading, not only for what they convey, but for how Alan Taylor is able to convey them. His first book was Liberty Men and Great Proprietors on the Revolutionary Frontier in Maine. And you are originally from Maine and started your career at Colby College. And sorry, there's testing the smoke detectors in our building today, and I was going to mute myself when it went off.
It always happens when you're trying to do something.
Here it is. So Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, and then you follow that up with William Cooper's Town. You moved west on the frontier to upstate New York, and looking at that. And that book received the Bancroft Prize, the Beveridge Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize. And I think I could go through the rest of the titles you have written, but we'll never get to the real subject of talking to you about what you've been doing. You're working now on a fourth volume in a series of books about North America. The first was American Colonies, followed by American Revolutions, and the most recent one published is American Republic. So really looking at American history in a new way, looking at it in the context of North America. So how did you get to thinking about, say, the revolution in the context of North America as a whole?
Right. Well, I'd done American colonies first, and colonial history had already by that point become much broader, breaking away from just thinking about the 13 colonies, but thinking about how those 13 colonies were part of 27 colonies in the British Empire in North America, and then how those colonies were embedded in transatlantic relationships, and then also in continental relationships with native peoples. Those were the two trends in the colonial period. So, and they were trends that very much interested me. So I wrote American Colonies in that vein. And then I was encouraged to write a sequel to American Colonies for the revolutionary generation. And it occurred to me that in the revolutionary field at that time, it lagged behind the colonial field in terms of broadening out. Now, of course, there have always been people interested in things like the French alliance or even the Spanish engagement. But these things had always been considered kind of sidelights to the main story. The main story was the development of the United States. Well, that is the most important story, but that story doesn't make any sense unless you embed this new United States in all of these other relationships, including with native peoples. And so I set out to write a book that was compatible with American colonies, but for the American Revolutionary period.
It really is. And you do focus a lot on the frontier, which is, I think, the way people were thinking about their world. But you begin and you end with a very Boston story, a Hawthorne short story, My Kinsman Majorolino. So
right.
Can you talk a little bit about how Majorolino fits into the overall idea of the American revolutions?
Right. It's a story that's long fascinated me, and I've used it often in my teaching because I think at a symbolic level, it gets right to the heart of what the revolution was within the United States. I don't want to ruin the story for people who haven't read it. I encourage you to read it.
Yes.
But just in short, it's about a young man who has grown up very much in the old regime of the colonial period, in which patronage client relations are in the foreground. And he goes to Boston expecting that his kinsman, Major Molyneux, is a very powerful man there and will be able to take care of him. And he will find out that things have been inverted.
Mhm.
And it's about his process of discovering this and then having to make a choice of whether he will engage in this emerging new regime, or if he will cling to the old one. And it's that kind of choice that so many Americans had to make. And not all of them embraced the new
Mhm.
regime. There
Yeah.
were a fair number of them who were much more comfortable in the social logic of the older regime. So it's
Mhm.
a story that says, the American Revolution really did make a powerful difference in how people imagined their society to work. And therefore, once you imagine it differently, you start to behave differently.
Mhm.
So the revolution does make a big difference. And I
Mhm.
think that story really gets to the heart of how it changes things.
It does. And you do really a lot with the people who want to remain loyal. And as they see this world shifting, that is, they see the committees arriving and
Mhm.
new sources of power. And it really is a challenge to the way things have been. There's that wonderful quote you use as the epigraph to one chapter from, I think, Mather Byles, about is it better to be governed by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or 3,000 tyrants who surround you? And,
Right.
and it really is a changing
Yeah.
perception of how politics works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a sea change, and not everybody's on board. It's a challenge particularly for older people.
Hmm.
They were used to what the rules of the game were,
Yeah,
and to change those rules raises fears that all of the rules will change, and
right.
that's a very uncomfortable feeling for a lot of Americans.
It really is. And then there are some institutions which change and other don't. I mean, you do, I don't want to say you spend a lot of time with, I mean, you think you give due attention to the loyalists and to other issues, but I wonder, well, let me just say, what surprised you? Now you're doing this in-depth look at the revolution. You've written other books on the revolution. You've taught the revolution. Did anything surprise you as you were working on this book?
Well, you're right that I do spend a lot of time on the loyalists, and that's in part because I'd written a previous book which focused on Canada and
Hmm.
was interested in Americans who moved there, both right after the Revolution and then continuing into the early 19th century. And I did become intrigued by what is the loyalist case? Why would people be attracted to it? I grew up with a perfectly good American civics education, which entirely left the loyalists out, and it just seemed like everybody would unite behind the
Hmm.
American Revolution.
Yeah.
And I think that robs the American Revolution of its true depth and drama. It is a conflict in which there are Americans who are on the other side, and they
Hmm.
had very good reasons
Right.
for doing that. That doesn't mean that I embrace their reasons, but I want to understand them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh, so I would say that getting to understand the loyalist perspective was particularly enriching for me in doing this book.
I'll bet. Yes. You're now what I've observed in looking at revolutions generally is the relatively easy part is getting rid of the bad old regime. The more difficult one is creating a new one that won't be worse.
Yeah.
And I wonder, your book American Republics looks more at that, but also this book does
Yeah.
talk about the creation of new governments. Can we talk a little bit about what goes into that process of creating new regimes in the American
Yeah.
states?
I do think that we so focus on the creation of the national federal constitution
Hmm.
that we lose sight of the creation of the state
Yeah.
constitutions. And creating the state constitutions is arguably at least as important
Hmm.
in this particular generation, and are essential foundation for even conceiving of a national federal constitution. So John Adams put this quite well, as he often puts things quite well, which is, we're a generation that can actually sit down and consciously frame our own governments. We can hash this out, whereas other people just inherit these things that seem to be that are centuries old in their arrangements, and they can't do anything about it. We can do something about it. We can design it. And it is that concept of, okay, we get to get this right because we can consciously sit down and deliberate and then write it down and kind of try to pin down future generations to follow our template, is so important to the American Revolution, this whole way of thinking. And it emerges with the state constitutions, and then it's going to be manifest in the federal constitution. I do try to say in the book, and this may be a little controversial, is they don't have it all figured out. They're making compromises. They realize the future is going to evolve in ways that they won't be able to control, no matter what they put in writing. And they punted on some important issues like slavery. They understood that they had to make a pact with slavery and write it into the Constitution in indirect ways, with the 3/5 clause and the fugitive slave clause and the prolonging the African slave trade for at least 20 years. So, and what emerges is not a consolidated nation.
No.
We have this hindsight that we sit in the 20th and now the 21st century in a powerful superpower, and with a what has until recently been a cohesive national government. And we think, well, that got started back in 1787. Well, in a limited degree, yes. But the Civil War and the rearrangement of the Constitution, the amendments there is really going to be a second founding. So that it's very important not to give to think that the founders solved all the fundamental questions, because they didn't.
There's that moment at the Constitutional Convention when they're talking about, we're not just doing this for us, but for generations unborn. I think it's Nathaniel Gorham who said, can we really conceive that the people of this country, including the Western Territory, will still be living under one government in 150 years? It was inconceivable. And yet we are, we hope.
Well, we are, but, after a civil war that killed 800,000 Americans, so it's not like there haven't been major opportunities for the whole thing to blow up along the way.
That's right. That's right. So I think one thing that they do at this time is prevent a blow up, and they had one revolution. So how do the state constitutions, we just started talking about Majorolino and this change in perceptions. So do the state constitutions then represent a change in the structures of power here in these colonies or in these states?
Well, it varies. Some of the constitutions are much more radical than others. So, for example, Pennsylvania is the model radical constitution, one which dramatically changes things. Massachusetts is probably the prime case of a relatively conservative constitution, one that is attempting to stabilize the changes wrought by the Revolution. And other constitutions tend to fall in between these two poles. Ultimately, it's the Massachusetts constitutional model that will be more influential on more states and will be more influential on the federal Constitution of 1787, whereas the more radical Constitution of Pennsylvania gets set aside in 1790.
Now, of course, Rev 250 is based in Massachusetts, and so we know a lot about the revolution here, but your book, American Revolutions, is a tremendous book which everyone should read carefully. You should assign it if you're a teacher. But you do focus a lot on places outside Massachusetts, which is
Mhm.
salutary. We learn more about Virginia as well as about the frontier and the other colonies.
Mhm.
So, how does the revolution happen in Virginia? I mean, we can draw a straight line from Samuel Adams to dumping the tea and changing a government, but it's a little more murky how we get guys like George Washington on board
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
this, or Jefferson. So, what's their outlook on this, and how does Virginia become such a big part of the story?
Well, Virginia pretty early on is feeling like the British Empire treats them unfairly. And they got pretty good grounds for it in that Britain's mercantile laws, the Navigation Acts, very much mandate that tobacco, which is the primary export crop produced in Virginia, will only go to Britain. And the credit arrangements that are set up, it creates a kind of monopoly relationship where Scottish merchants will be conducting this trade. And Virginia's elite is drawing their consumer goods almost entirely through these merchants. There's no manufacturing in Virginia. And they just feel that the terms of trade are stacked against them.
Mm-hmm.
And they also feel that Britain is blocking their ambitions to expand westward. Virginia's got very robust ambitions. They kind of think of everything west of the Appalachian Mountains as properly theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And Britain is trying to slow that all down and question whether Virginia really is going to have primacy among all the colonies in that region. So Virginians have a lot of frustrated ambitions, and they come to focus their frustrations on Britain. There are internal disputes about funding the Anglican ministry there. And when there is an appeal by the Anglican ministers to the Privy Council, the Privy Council rules in favor of the ministers, and that's just regarded as an interference in the domestic affairs of Virginia. So Virginians come in 1765 to define themselves as earlier than any other colony, to say we've got a relationship with the crown, but it's a limited one where we have domestic autonomy. The crown gets to regulate our trade, but that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other colonies are actually playing catch up on that. So, as you know, I'm from New England, so I understand the importance of Boston. But there's a case that can be made, and I'm trying to make it, that Virginia is co-equal in the leadership of the push for greater autonomy within the British Empire that will culminate in a Declaration of Independence. And it's no accident that Jefferson is on the committee that writes it, and so is John Adams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A coalition between Massachusetts and Virginia is essential to the Patriot leadership at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it? We're talking with Alan Taylor, who is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia, and the author of, among other books, American Revolutions: A Continental History. And you also have written, The Internal Enemy, about slavery and the war in Virginia, which did receive the Pulitzer Prize in 2014. So slavery, of course, about 40% of Virginians were enslaved, and it sparked Samuel Johnson's quip about how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes. And so what role does slavery play in this, as well as what was then the role that what roles did they enslaved people take once the trouble started? It's a big question, which could probably occupy us for another day or two.
Yeah, that certainly could. Half of the enslaved people in the 13 colonies lived in the single colony of Virginia. Now, Virginia is the biggest colony. It's had enslaved people for the longest period of any of the continental colonies. The leadership of Virginia, these great men who rise to the top of the colony and then also of the revolutionary movement, are all slaveholders. They have a certain comfort level and a certain amount of leisure time, which is all found. What's not the foundation of it is that they run these large operations, large agricultural operations, which are dependent on enslaved labor. They also, particularly in the case of Jefferson, are people who are very attracted to the writings of the Enlightenment, particularly the Scottish brand of the Enlightenment, which is quite clear about individual rights being universal. So this is a real contradiction that they wrestle with, because they like to think of themselves in the vanguard of enlightenment and of a revolution that is going to rearrange politics in a way in which universal human rights are foundational. And yet they are the beneficiaries of a system of coercive, unequal labor. And they are, the thoughtful ones among them are tormented by this. And thoughtful ones, I include Washington or Jefferson. Now, we can certainly say, okay, they're tormented, but what do they do about it? Yeah. And, Washington does something at the end. In his will, he frees the slaves that belong to him. Jefferson does almost none of that. And neither of them does anything really. Well, you could say Jefferson writes the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that restricts slavery, and he's on board with the end of the African slave trade, which will, the legislation will pass in 1807, becomes effective January 1st, 1808. But other than that, their actions lag far behind their words. But Britain is kind of ambiguous about its own position on slavery in this particular period. There is the Somerset Decision, a very important decision made by Lord Mansfield in 1772, which says that slavery exists in the colonies where there is positive law, in other words, statute law, that sustains it. But there's no such law in England, and therefore there's no place in natural law for slavery, and so slavery is just not legal in England. This is a ruling that is of some concern. Now, is it the primary reason why people waged the revolution? No, but is it something that gives a lot of people pause within the colonies to find themselves in the awkward position of being told you live on the margins, the kind of barbaric margins where you can have slavery, whereas in the metropole, the advanced, civilized, libertarian metropole, it's not? That's part and parcel of what they're rebelling against, is the notion that they are second-class subjects on the barbaric fringes of an empire in which civility radiates from the center in London. And the Somerset Decision is part of that. Not all of it, but part of it. And so it's one of these things where Virginians had been trying to shut down the import slave trade into Virginia because they felt they had more than enough enslaved people for their economic needs. And they're worried about the security implications of having a still growing African-American population held in slavery in their midst. So Virginians are really uncomfortable with the Somerset Decision, and they get more uncomfortable when Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia in 1775, starts to say, look, if you guys rebel, I'm going to rally the slaves against you. Okay, well, that is, if you want to really alienate slave-owning Virginians, that's all you got to say.
Right.
And then Dunmore follows through with it in his proclamation in November of 1775, at which point a lot of these planters who've been kind of wavering as to which way to go, it's clear to them that they're going to support the revolution. So I don't know if I fully answered you. Well, I haven't answered the part about what about enslaved people. And enslaved people nurtured what we might call a myth, but it's a very reassuring myth, and it's one that's found in many different societies which are highly unequal. And it is that the ruler of the society, whether it's the Tsar in Russia or the king in Britain, actually wants you to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And has issued an order to free serfs or slaves, but that the middlemen of an empire are blocking this. And these kinds of rumors are recurrent in the 18th century. And they get a new lease on life with the revolution coming along, because in the enslaved quarters, what people are saying to themselves is, well, the masters here are all getting up this revolution because they're trying to block the king from freeing us. Now, of course, the king hadn't issued an order to free them, but when you are held in oppression, you will clutch after whatever belief enables you to think that there is a venue for you to pursue your own freedom. So it inclines enslaved people in the South to look upon the British as liberators to a greater degree than, in fact, the British really were. But by showing up at British military camps saying, we're here to help you and we expect you're here to free us, it puts pressure on the British, because a lot of British military officers relish the position of casting the patriots of the revolution as hypocrites.
Right.
And a prime way they can do that is by saying, look, we're the ones that liberate slaves. Now, they're not liberating slaves across the board. They're not liberating the slaves of loyalists. They're not liberating the slaves in their loyal West Indian colonies. The British aren't showing up here because they've got some categorical commitment to emancipation. They do not. But if they see an opportunity to weaken the patriots by liberating a lot of slaves, that's what they'll do, and they do.
Well, thank you. We are talking with Alan Taylor, the author of American Revolutions and other books. Here is something you may or may not know, that in 1908, the Congress designated the first battle of the American Revolution to be Point Pleasant, Virginia, in September of 1774. Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that.
Yeah. So I don't think there's any need. We can't argue with Congress.
Well, we know Americans never do that, right?
No, we never do. And
my distinguished historians, of course,
that's right. Well, the thing that really strikes me, of course, is that the senator from Massachusetts in 1908 was a distinguished historian, and I always wonder where Henry Cabot was that day. Yeah. Where was he when Congress?
I suspect that he voted against that.
I would suspect so too. He thought he could have wielded a little more influence.
I would think.
Yeah. So this is part. Can you tell us anything more about Dunmore?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty hard today to make the case for Point Pleasant as in 1908, Lord Dunmore was the commander at Point Pleasant.
I should say, Alan, that the West Virginia state historian in 1908 said, no, this is wrong. This wasn't the first battle.
Well, that's honorable of him.
Probably lost his job.
It wasn't Dunmore is desperately trying to rally Virginians to stay loyal to the empire in 1774. And he sees the opportunity to do this by supporting their land grab against native peoples living in the Ohio Valley. And that's what Point Pleasant's about.
Yeah.
So it's very cynical. It's a provoked war. It was provoked by murders of native peoples. It's an unnecessary war. So if in celebrating the American Revolution, one of the last things I would want to do is associate it with the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774.
Yeah. And I believe that actually Tecumseh's father died at the Battle of Point Pleasant. He's a figure who will have a great impact in the War of 1812 and beyond. So how much was the frontier involved in the American Revolution? I mean, I think it's one of the things your book does very well is draw our attention north and west and south.
Well, we appropriately pay a lot of attention to the taxation issue in leading to the revolution. I think we don't pay enough attention to the ambitions of colonists to expand westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains and the degree to which the British Empire is seen as insufficiently cooperative with that.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue of the West is another major reason for the alienation of the leaders of most of the colonies against the empire. And then for this new country, the population in the second half of the 18th century is doubling every 22 years, largely through natural increase. But they also want to attract a lot more immigrants. So, and they want to also, the vast majority of these leaders want to sustain the country as an agricultural country, and they want to sustain the standard of living for the next generation at least as high as their parents' generation had, which means if you're going to double the population every 22 years and you want people to have farms comparable to their parents, you're going to have to double the land held by this new United States every 22 years. And the only way they're going to do that is by expanding westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains into the west. So the entire society is premised on continued expansion of its population and continued expansion of farms held by farm families. And because they want to prolong the period in which there's a pretty broad middle class of farmers, which will effectively hold political power as the citizens. They want to prolong that, and they want to delay as long as possible developing an industrial working class of the sort that many of them were familiar with had emerged in Britain. And the extreme inequality of British society is something they see as a problem for the Republic in the future. So the only way they're going to fend off the development of that kind of inequality is by expanding westward and preserving an agricultural society of many farmers with modest-sized farms. And so the West is essential to their vision of a prolonged future for the Republic. And it means that in the revolutionary generation, they've got to do their best while fending off British forces in the East is job number one. Job number two is make sure we got a credible claim that we can exercise with armed force west of the mountains. That goes more poorly for them militarily because the native peoples there are mostly allied with the British Empire. But they get some indirect help from the Spanish, who are operating in Louisiana and Florida at that time. And ultimately, they get a lot of help from their diplomats, who will negotiate a deal at Paris in 1782 to 83 that will give them as much as they could reasonably expect, which is a western boundary on the Mississippi River and a northern boundary on the Great Lakes and a southern boundary on the margins of Florida, which means that they have secured not just the Atlantic seaboard, but they've secured the land that they will need to expand for the next generation west of the Appalachian Mountains. They've secured it diplomatically. They haven't secured it militarily, and they won't secure it militarily until the 1790s when they will complete some wars against native peoples. Right.
And then there are some challenges after that. I mean, you wrote the book on the Civil War of 1812, the American citizens, British subjects, Irish rebels, and Indian allies. I mean, it's an area fraught with violence, and it's contested well after that. Now, you've been working on this series looking at North America. So I'm wondering now if you see this all of a piece, or are there discontinuities among these different generations of American colonies, the revolutions, republics, whatever the Civil Wars volume will be called. I mean, is this each generation figuring it out anew, or is there some line you can see running through this?
Well, we haven't yet achieved what Jefferson called for, which is approximately every 22 years, you just have a new constitution and every generation gets to rework things for themselves. That's a classic, Jefferson thinking out loud, and it's of course not going to happen. Madison was appalled by that thought and said, you better keep that to yourself. You can share that with me, but that's not going to happen. Every historian I'll just limit myself to historians of the United States or of North America, wrestles with how do you balance continuity against change? Because both are present in every generation, every year, every day.
Right.
So absolutely, the conditions in North America are different in 1850 than they were in 1750. Remarkably different in many ways. But that the United States that doesn't exist in 1750 and is the dominant power in North America in 1850 has not done this entirely on its own. They have had to win liberation from the most powerful transatlantic empire in the world, Britain. They have done so in alliance with France. They have done so with indirect aid from the other significant power in the Americas of the 1770s, Spain. And they have done so in conflict with an array of native peoples who have been trying to defend their own homelands. That I don't think there's anything automatic about how this played out. There are, of course, many people today who think there's something providential about the triumph of the American Revolution and the triumph of the United States in North America. And that is certainly a way of looking at things, but that's not the way academic historians look at things. They very much see all of the ways in which things are highly contingent, that there were alternative futures, and that it hinges upon the actions of all sorts of people, usually constructing coalitions in which there are varying goals of the members of these coalitions, and nobody gets entirely what they want from these things. But what people do, the coalitions that they do enter into, and how they prevail in the conflicts that emerge along the way, makes all the difference in the world.
Great. Thank you. We've been talking with Alan Taylor, the author of American Revolutions, along with other distinguished books. And I think we've covered a lot of ground, Alan, and we could spend the next week or two talking about these things. Given us
that would exhaust our listeners' patience.
It would exhaust our listeners.
They want to sleep along the way.
But thank you for joining us. And
I'm happy to do it. Thank you for having me on.
And I do want to thank our listeners. Alan, when we started these podcasts, we thought we'd have a handful of people in and around Massachusetts, but actually we have a global audience. And so we have regular listeners in England. We have folks tuning in London and in Edinburgh and other parts of the United Kingdom, and in Europe, in Thailand, at Yugo Village in Guam, and as well as, for your benefit, Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon, and places in between. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Jonathan Lane, our man behind the curtain. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.